Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by and welcome to today's Rational User Community webinar. Our topic for today is the power of the attribute template extended to drive metrics collection. Our presenter today is Alex Ivanov, a senior software engineer with honors at Raytheon Integrated Defense Systems. Alex Ivanov, a senior software engineer with honors at Raytheon Integrated Defense Systems, graduated from Boston University in 2000 with a BS in Computer Systems Engineering. For the past 10 years, he has written numerous DXL scripts, helped maintain several DOORS databases, and worked with hundreds of users to help them improve their understanding of DOORS. Alex specializes in consulting with programs, large and small, to help people get the most out of IBM Rational DOORS. Alex has attended numerous Telelogic and IBM conferences to share his knowledge and is well respected within the DOORS support community. Alex is an IBM certified deployment specialist, DOORS version 9, and in 2011 was awarded the title of IBM Champion, as well as being reelected in 2012. Thank you all for joining us today. All phones are in a listen-only mode, and later there'll be a question and answer session with instructions being given at that time. You may also ask a question at any time using the chat window located in the GoToMeeting control panel. Chat questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Today's session is being recorded, and you'll be provided a copy of today's materials following the call. We'd like to start the webcast with a short question poll to get everyone's feedback. I'm going to launch that poll now. And how long have you been using DOORS is the poll, and we'd love to hear your feedback. Less than 1 year, 1 to 5 years, or 5+ years. The poll is now open, and we'll allow a minute for everyone to complete this poll, followed by sharing the results. Great, thank you for your contributions. We're starting to see answers come in. If you have not filled in your question or your answer, please take a minute and complete the short poll. Excellent. Thank you for your contributions. We'll give it just a few more seconds for everyone to have the opportunity to complete this short poll. Fantastic. Thank you for your contributions on this short poll. And we're going to go ahead, and I'd like to thank everyone for completing this poll. And the results are, looks like less than 1 year is 27%, 1 to 5 years is 24%, and 5+ years is 49%. Thank you once again for everyone for taking the time to complete the short poll. I would now like to turn the conference over to Alex. Alex, take it away.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you everybody for joining. So I'm very excited today to be able to share with you how we use the attribute template to drive our metrics collection. So as Chris mentioned, I've been working with DOORS for over 10 years. I've been privileged enough to support DOORS on some very large-scale programs. When I say large-scale, I'm talking about over 400 requirement specifications, housing over 100,000 requirements, and we use DOORS for a lot more than just requirements traceability. We actually have our test artifacts in DOORS, traceability to test procedures, certification modules, you name it. So we've really extended IBM Rational DOORS to support a lot of different things. And so I'm happy to be sharing some of my experiences with you today. So let's step through the agenda and talk about what we're going to discuss. So attribute template. Again, part of having a successful database where you're managing your requirements, it's very important to keep track of what types of fields you're actually using in DOORS. So again, when we start talking about keeping track of more than just requirement modules, maybe keeping track of test procedures, it's very important to know if you're looking at a requirement spec, like what are the types of fields or what are the types of information you want to keep track of in the database. So for example, under requirements, you might want to keep track of the verification method that's going to be used to define the testing for that requirements. So we're going to talk about the attribute template, what it is. We're going to talk about what we use it for. So keeping track of attributes. Again, want to make sure you have a standard set of attributes across your specs. The worst thing you can do is have verification method defined 5 different ways, text in one place, string in another, enumerated attribute in another. That's a surefire doom to being able to automate any sort of metrics collection. So again, important to keep track of attributes, their consistency. We'll talk about the fact that we can keep track of views as well. Again, the attribute template is at the heart of any DOORS program that we support. You have a lot of information contained in there for reference. You can produce documentation. Now when we start getting into some of the automation that it can be used for, you can actually copy attributes and views from this one attribute template module out to many, many different modules in your database. So that's very powerful as well. And then we'll get into the heart of the presentation, which talks about how we use the attribute template to drive your metrics collection. We'll take a step through of the current metrics process. Well, technically it's not current anymore because we use the attribute template, but this is what the state of what we had. We did have automation in place to collect metrics, so we'll go over what we used to do and what we do now, and then we'll conclude that with questions. So let's take a look at the attribute template. What is the attribute template? So in here I have a screenshot of the James Bond car project, and what I wanted to showcase with this slide is that we have a standards folder. Again, we reuse the same architecture across multiple programs, and it definitely can be reused. So we have a standards folder in every single project that is using DOORS. And in the standards folder, we have an attribute template. Attribute template is just a formal DOORS module. Again, it's important. This is your official single source for where you're keeping track of all the attribute definitions and types that you're going to be using in your database. So if somebody wanted to know, okay, well, I hear you're using verification method in your requirement specs. They know that they can find the attribute template in the standards folder, regardless of which program they're on, and in there they can find what the verification method is. So again, the attribute template is a lot of different things. If you have documents in Excel or in Word, possibly you're just starting to use DOORS, you want to leverage some of the capabilities, some of the automation, some of the rigor that's involved with being able to have a proven process. So you want to get things out of Word, out of Excel into DOORS. So the attribute template is a great place to look and see, okay, well, what are my standard attributes? So just because your Excel named different things, it would be important that when you import it in, you import the column that is maybe named ways of testing the requirements, you rename that to verification method. So to make sure that the contents, like the test, analysis, inspection, makes their way in to the standard verification method attribute. Again, we talked about how it's the official location for the attribute definitions and types. This is where you can actually point your users to say, okay, you want to see a list of all the attributes you are responsible for filling out in the requirement modules. Go look at a view in the attribute template. And again, it's a great place for just looking up what the attribute means. We store a lot of information in the attribute template apart from just the definition and type, so users can find out what the attribute is, when they're on the hook to actually populate it, what modules it's used in, and a whole lot more information. So capturing information in the attribute template. So you've got the attribute template indoors, and now how do you actually update this module? So what you do is you want to create the actual attribute definition and type. So we'll use the verification method as an example. So if you want to keep track of verification method in your requirements modules, you need to define the verification method type. I'm a big believer in using enumerated types when you know what the pick list should be. So for verification method, again, we know we want inspection, demonstration, analysis, and test. Generally, when we define enumerated types, we put in a not assessed value, and we make that the default. Again, from the metrics perspective, it makes it easy to count how many requirements have not had their verification method assessed. And likewise, we like to put an NA as an extra choice into the enumerated pick list, such that for objects there may be not requirements or headers, somebody can just tag it as NA, so that way it doesn't show up as this has not been assessed. So a general good rule is to, whenever you have enumerated types, to have a not assessed as the default value and an NA for not applicable. But so for verification method, I would define my verification method type, the enumerated type in the attribute template. And then I would define my verification method attribute, and that's what you can see on the screen here. This is just a snapshot of what you get if you want to edit attributes. Now, what is slightly different from maybe just creating the attributes and their types in the attribute template is that we also create an object in the attribute template for every attribute. Now, this is very important. What we see here is basically a screenshot that shows the verification method object and the required object. So the reason we put an object in is to make use of the DOORS capabilities, in that by having an object in place, we can tag these attributes with other characteristics, like when it should be used, the description, whether or not it applies to requirement modules. Now, the key between creating the object and the attribute is that when you create the object, you want to make sure that you fill in for the object text, you put in the exact name of the attribute. That's how the automation can make a connection between the two. Likewise, it's also very important that you have the actual objects in the attribute template are unique, in that you would not want to have two objects named verification method, because then any automation that wants to go look at the object to find out more information would get really confused. So it's important to keep them unique. We like having them in alphabetical order, so we have an alphabetical order of objects, so that way you can easily find the corresponding object. So we've talked about the fact that we have all these attributes in the attribute template, and we keep track of a lot of information about them. Now, because we have all the attributes in the attribute template, why not keep track of the views? So I'm a big believer that, of course, DOORS out of the box, users are free to create their own views, whether they be private views or public views. But I'm a big believer that I, as the DOORS database manager, can do a service to my users by actually providing them some basically pre-canned views that I create for them. And so that way, for example, requirement traceability. If you're using DOORS, chances are you're going to want to know, well, which requirements don't trace up to a parent, or which requirements don't have any incoming traceability links from a child. So why not use the DOORS administrator, figure out some views that you can push out to other modules for your users. Another popular view is a view that shows what are all the attributes that the users are responsible for filling in. So I think it's a good idea for the DOORS team to define some standard views and manage them in the attribute template. So then users know, okay, that these views are managed by the DOORS team, and they can expect to find them in every single requirement module. So again, because all the attributes are in the attribute template, it's easy to create views. Because again, as you know, when you create a view, you need to have the attribute that you want to use as a column, or you can use layout columns, and you can also save filter and sorting information with a view. This is very important, and we'll revisit this in more detail. But again, because you have all the attributes in one place in the attribute template, there's no reason as to why you can't put some standard views in the attribute template. So that way you always know what the views should be in all of your other specs. So like we just discussed with attributes, we want to create a corresponding object for the views. So in the attribute template, we actually have a couple of sections. We have a standard attribute section, and we have a standard view section. So again, you can create an object in the standard view section where for object text you put in the name of the view. And again, the reason you do this is such that you can actually keep track of other characteristics about that view. So again, the object text contains the view name. You could put in things like what this view is for. Now I should note that we came up with this concept of using the attribute template probably in DOORS version 4 or 5. So that was long before DOORS provided the ability to actually have a view description or an attribute description directly in line with the attribute like they do now in DOORS 9. So I still like having this information in the attribute template because we use it for a lot more than just seeing what the attribute is for in context. But for your users, I do encourage you to have an attribute description as part of the attribute definition, such that when they're editing the attribute in their requirement spec, they'd know what it's for. And again, we have a couple of booleans that we use. IsView is just a quick way of differentiating between that this object corresponds to a view versus an object that corresponds to an attribute. And in requirement module specifies, okay, yep, this is a view that's being used in requirement spec. Again, if you have multiple module types like a test procedure, maybe a test plan or requirement module, wouldn't it be nice to know which view corresponds to which module? So you keep track of that using attributes in the attribute template. So talked about having attribute definitions, having objects representing those attributes. Next thing I recommend you do is you actually have a view, or I should say sets of views in the attribute template that showcase basically which attributes belong to the requirement modules, for example. So you could filter this on that it belongs in a requirement module and that it's an object level attribute. And out the other end, you basically have a view called requirement attributes, and any user can load this view in the attribute template and see basically a table that shows them what are all the attributes that are standard attributes in the requirement specs, what are their descriptions, and when are they on the hook to actually use them. So again, the intention is you would create one of these views for every single module type that you're keeping track of indoors. So if you've got test procedures, you would have probably attributes that are specific to test procedures, and you can create a view using these concepts that I'm covering here for your users to say, okay, here are the standard attributes that you are on the hook to populate in the test procedure, same thing with the test plan, and so forth. So I recommend having a view for every different module type that you're keeping track of indoors. So likewise, you can do something very similar with the views, because we have the views defined in the attribute template. We've got objects that correspond to the views. You could have an overview view that talks about, okay, here are the standard views that you are providing to your users in a requirement module. Something else we like to do is the views that we provide as the Doors team, we like to put a prefix on them that separates them out from any user-defined views. So in general, we ask users when they create their views to use their Doors login. So we put their Doors login followed by an underscore followed by something to do with the name of the view. And anybody that creates public views, we just ask that they don't name them with whatever prefix it is we're using on the program. So for example, if my project was named James Bond Car Project, I would use JBC underscore perhaps as my prefix for the different views that I supply. So that way users in the James Bond Car Project would know anything that starts with JBC underscore is a supported view, and chances are it's documented in the attribute template. So we've got our attributes defined in the attribute template. We've got our views defined in the attribute template. We've got descriptions about them. We've got views about them. So why not extend these views into something else? So we already talked about how I like pointing users to the attribute template to say, here, you can go load a view to see the information about different attributes. But nothing says you can't actually export a view into like a Word table and insert it into a document. We do this for our Doors work instruction. We have kind of like a structure and process that details out what is the architecture on this program, what are all the traceability relationships. I mean, I highly encourage you to do that. It takes extra time, but it really makes it easier on anybody using the Doors database to know what all the relationships are, what are the different module types. And again, instead of trying to manage information in two places, which is something you should always avoid doing, you can basically have all of your attributes defined in the attribute template, and then when needs be, you can export that and include that as part of your Doors work instruction. Now, you can export it to a Word document, or you can export it to HTML. Something I have showing here is that you can actually, again, this is Doors out-of-the-box functionality, you can export the requirement attributes view into an HTML file. So what this will do is this will give you an HTML file that contains a list of the attributes, the descriptions when they're used, just as a table. And what you can do with this HTML file is, without much work, you can actually create a menu item indoors using custom DXL, which will, when the user clicks the menu item, it will bring up this HTML file which is something very powerful because you're basically giving them a menu item as opposed to telling them, well, go into the attribute template, load this view, that type of thing. And you could do both things, which is what we do. So what I've included here is literally all the code you would need as far as what you actually put into this menu item. So again, it's pretty straightforward. So you have a string where you put in the path to your HTML file, and then you just use the system call calling Internet Explorer or whatever web browser provider you have, and you call it with this variable to say, I want you to load this. So in turn, if you make this into a menu item indoors, when the user clicks that menu item, they'll be presented the table of attributes. So this is what the user would see. Again, now on our projects, we've gone one step further in that we actually have, not only do we have a menu item that the user clicks, but the HTML file that comes up, it has links within it such that you can click between text and tables, so it's pretty sophisticated. We have a couple of help menus that talk about how to use the Doors database and how do you verify requirements using Doors. But the idea is here. The idea is that you can get things out to HTML, and then you can create menu items to have users point to them directly within Doors. So now let's talk about how we can use the attribute template to actually push out these attributes. Again, this is where we start getting into some of the automation. Because you have custom DXL with Doors, it really opens the door to creating some powerful automation to radically improve how quickly you can not only use Doors, but how you can manage Doors. So we have a lot of automation for not only for users, but for Doors database administrators as well. Now when I say administrator, I'm really talking about anybody that's in the role of managing the Doors database, whether it be modules, access, views, attributes, users, I mean, you name it. Making sure that the database architecture is intact such that the users have as pleasant environment to work with as possible and the tooling available to them to make their jobs easier. So here we have, again, we're going back to our requirement attributes view, which lists all the standard attributes that we want in our requirement spec. So for example, if I was bringing in a new document from Word or Excel, I could create a brand new module just by right-clicking and say I want a new module. And then I could navigate to the attribute template, load this requirement attributes view, and run my copy attribute script, which would copy every single attribute that it finds in that view to my module. This is in essence what we do for new modules. So copy attribute script, you might ask me, well, what is that? So really this is the guts of the script right here. All you're doing is you're looping through the objects in the view. So as you may recall, the requirement attributes view is filtered on showing the objects that correspond to attributes that we consider standard attributes in our requirement specs. So we loop through a view, we grab the object text, which again contains the name of the attribute. So for example, we'd get to the verification method attribute. We'd read in the fact that we want the verification method attribute, then we would actually grab a copy of the attribute with the find command, and then there's this nifty function, copy attr def underscore, which I do not think is actually documented, but it works like a charm. If you provide the name, the attribute definition, what you want to copy from, so this is the verification method definition out of the attribute template, then you provide the name of the module it resides in, which is the, in this case, the attribute template, and then you provide the, I should say, the handle of the module, you want to copy it to. This will copy the attribute definition, it'll copy the type, very, very useful. So verification method, it will take the verification method type, verification method, basically take it exactly as it is and drop it into the module you want to go to. Something else that I wanted to point out is when you're copying attributes, when you're copying views, it's very, very important to be aware of what the access is that they're going to get. By default, they just inherit the access from the module, and I think it's a really bad idea for you to leave it that way. I think for these standard attributes and the standard views, it's critical that you restrict the access to the definition of the attribute, the definition of the type, and the definition of the view to be able to be modified only by a Doors administrator. I mean, in this case, Doors administrators is the group name that I picked. Hopefully, you're using Doors groups and you're not using individual user accounts. That's something else that I recommend staying away from when you're updating access, to just make sure you're using doors groups. But so in this particular case, basically what the code is doing is it's setting the access. What I'm using here is, the example is the attribute definition, but you'd have very similar code for attribute type definition and the view. Point being is you want to restrict access such that in the end it says something along the lines of your doors administrator group has full access, everybody else has read access, something along those lines, to make sure that any users, regardless of whether they're requirement authors or not, don't have the ability to mess around with access. If you don't lock this down, you have a surefire way of users being able to go in and tweak the pick list or something along those lines, and you don't want that to happen. So pushing out views, exactly the same idea. If you want to copy views from the attribute template, you could have very similar code. The only problem being is that I'm unaware of any single function that would copy the whole view for you. So here I've included some code which, again, does something very, very similar, where it goes through a given view, it looks through the objects, which again correspond to the views. So you pick out which views you want to copy, but now because I'm not aware of any single function, you kind of have to do this slightly longer. So you loop through all the different columns in the given view, and then I've kind of included an outline of what it is you'd want to do, where you just clear away, so the module you're copying to, you would load the module and clear away all the columns. Then you could load the view, let's say in the attribute template, and you could start looping through each column to determine if it's an attribute, layout, DXL, or the main column that has object heading, object text. You can insert a column by that exact same characteristic into the target module, the requirement module you're copying things into, and then go on to the next one. So you keep going through, so when you're done, you basically have all the columns in the target module that you had in the attribute template in the view. But then you can grab the filtering and the sorting. Again, this can be done very easily through DXL, and you want to save the view in the target module. And last but not least, make sure you restrict the access. The worst thing you can do is not restrict the access and then have yourself pointing a user to a view just to have them go into the view, and it looks nothing like you expected it to look. So important to keep the access to the doors admins. Again, and so now we get into, well, how do we use the attribute template to drive metrics collection? So here, again, I cannot stress enough how important it is to have consistent attribute definitions. So what we've covered up to this point hopefully will help you in making sure that you have a standard attribute definition and type defined in that attribute template, and everywhere where an attribute is used by that name, it's exactly the same as to what you have in the attribute template. So for metrics, we have tried lots of different things. What has worked well for us is to actually have a metrics module directly in Doors. So it's a formal module sitting in the Doors database, which has line items for each requirement spec and counts for attributes. So here's a snapshot of what the metrics module looks like. Again, all level 1 items, and it's got a row for every requirement spec. So each attribute in the metrics module corresponds to a count. So for example, num required in this case is the number of requirements in that particular module. Num trace in this case is looking at how many requirements have incoming, at least one incoming traceability link. So again, you can invent, as you can see, the process I'm about to show you, you can invent pretty much anything you want with respect to what you want to count. So here are the, again, back in our attribute template, we have a view called metrics attributes, and it's showing us what are all the different counts that we're keeping track of in our metrics modules. So again, you do the same type of thing. You would create the attribute in the attribute template. You would create a corresponding object for it in the attribute template. You could put in the description. Again, this is very important to have a description such that you know what is being counted. So that way users that want to know what are they being tracked on, they can go to the attribute template and see what the logic is. So again, just picked out a handful of objects to show here. So number of requirements, we're looking for required is set to true. Trace, again, we're looking for requirements that have at least one incoming link through the requirements links link module. I should note that we found a lot of success in having our link relationships basically separated out by different module types in the relationships between them. So for example, for keeping track of our requirement traceability links, we use just one link module. So we have one requirements links link module, and we know that if we're linking from a child requirement spec up to the parent, they're all using the same link module. I think it makes it a lot easier for reporting and metrics purposes, because you can apply the same criteria, the fact that, hey, I want to see what has links going through requirements links across all of your specs, as opposed to having to worry, well, if I'm sitting at this level, I'm using this link module, or if I'm sitting at this level, I'm using this link module. So in general, if we have a link from like a test plan to a requirement, we would designate a separate link module for that. So when requirement to requirement uses requirements links, when you start talking about other module types linking to requirements, you should put that into a separate link module. So let's take a look at the current approach for capturing metrics. Again, this is not technically current right now, but this is what it was before we came up with this approach. The idea being is that we figure out what we want to count and represent that with a filter, because that's the quickest way of counting, to actually just apply a filter and it comes back with how many objects satisfy the filter criteria. So I'd have a metric script where I'd put in the filtering logic, and so this is just a snapshot of the filter logic as it used to be in our metric script. We'd apply this filter across all of our requirement specs, and then we'd store those results back in the metrics module attributes. I've included a sample BAT file, so this is something else we found to be extremely successful, in that things like metrics that you want to see on a daily basis, I mean, why have somebody run the script manually when Doors actually gives you the ability to run it from the command line? So what I've included here is really just a sample command line file that you just point to it to where your metric script is. Typically these things run from the server. I like having the script directly on the server, so that way you know nobody can touch it. You tell it which project to run on. You need to put in your username and password. So that has to be right in this BAT script. That's another reason for putting this on some area that not everybody can get to. And then you have a line item that calls Doors. So in this example, this is calling Doors 8, but in your case, you would replace this with Doors 9 or whatever version you're using. And it's as simple as that. What you can do with this BAT file once you've updated it to have the information specific to your program is you can actually schedule this as a Windows schedule task to have it just kick off this BAT file. And it'll run the metrics off hours, and it'll save you and your program a lot of time. So now let's take a look at the enhanced metrics. What the enhanced metrics does is it basically, as we mentioned, with a Doors view, you can associate a filter. So instead of hard coding in the metric script, here's my filter to say how many objects have required equals true, why not save a view in the attribute template that has that filter associated with it? So in this particular case, I would just save a view in the attribute template that when I load the view and brought up filter details, I would see the filter details telling me that required equals true. And so what the new approach would be is to basically loop through views in the attribute template, pick out the ones that relate to metrics, grab their filters, and for each one, as you're grabbing the filter, you apply it to all the modules. So really, everything is the same. The only difference being, instead of hard coding in the name of the filter, and of course, as the filters get more and more advanced, it gets more painful to update the code, test the code, that type of thing. So instead of doing that, just represent it with filters that are associated to views in the attribute template, and then store them in the metrics module. So again, the old approach was to create a count in the attribute template, describe it in the attribute template, and really the heart of this was the 3 and 4. That's what used to take the longest, to update and test the code in the metric script, hold the peer review to make sure you didn't make any mistakes. In general, if you're writing any custom DXL, I cannot stress how important it is to have at least one other subject matter expert and hold peer reviews where you can have somebody else look at the code, see if you made any mistakes. Very, very critical if you want to be successful having custom DXL in place. And then we deploy the code. So the new approach is literally, so again, we'd still create VM inspection. So in this particular case, I want to know how many requirements have verification methods set to inspection. But now I create a view in the attribute template. Instead of updating the metric script, so it's very important, I no longer have to touch my metric script. If you're using this approach, it's as simple as just following kind of these steps. So I'd create a view. Now, because the attribute template already contains a lot of your standard views, you need a way of differentiating the views that drive your metrics collection from the other views. So what we found to be useful is to use some sort of prefix that would be different. So For example, the metrics views, we lead off of an underscore, because chances are other views won't start with underscore. So you could have like an underscore metrics underscore. That's your special sign to the automation that these are the views you should be looking for. And anything that follows the underscore metrics underscore, we have that be the actual name of the count. So that way this can be parsed out at the time of script execution. You know how to find the views, and you know what the count is because it's what follows the underscore metrics underscore. So again, in this case, I would add a filter, for example, that says required equals true and verification method includes inspection. And I would save that filter into this view. And the metrics script could actually create this count and, again, populate in the metrics module, and you don't need to change any code. So this is very, very powerful. So here's a snapshot, again, kind of at the heart of what this new metrics script is going to do. So we have a regular expression that literally it looks for any views that starts with metrics underscore, it starts with underscore metrics underscore, also keeping note of what follows that. So here we're looping through all the views in the attribute template. We're only picking out the ones that have the special metrics in them. Then we're grabbing the view name, we're loading the view name, and the important thing here is we're also plucking out what the name of the count is. Because as you may recall, everything that follows underscore metrics underscore is the actual name of our metrics count. So we put into a skip list the name of the count, that becomes the key, and the actual data is a filter variable. So the data is the filter. And again, skip lists are very powerful in that they allow you to keep track of lots of information based on a unique key, guaranteeing that you cannot have two entries of the same thing. And so now that we have these entries in this skip list, now we're going to do the inverse. We're going to loop through these entries on every single requirement spec. So when you load a requirement spec, you kind of apply this code where you grab the name of the count, you would find the count in the metrics module. If you can't find it in the metrics module, you can use our handy function copy add or def to actually copy it from the attribute template. Again, this is completely hands-off, and then you would just apply the filter and store the results in the counts. So again, if you take these couple of pages and turn them into a metric script, every time you need to add a new count, it's as simple as just updating the attribute template, which is a huge time saver. Now, but there's certain things that you just cannot represent with a filter. Again, using this approach, we've been able to, I think, automate to like 90% of the things we possibly want to count indoors. Of course, it's important, again, to have standard attributes, but once you write the script once, again, to add a new count, it's as simple as just creating the num underscore, whatever you want to name the count in attribute template, and creating a view corresponding to it using the naming convention. Once you do that, the important thing is just to associate the filter, and that's it. Your metrics, again, you can set up your metrics to run off hours, so when you add a new count, it takes me like literally 5 minutes. I suppose if the filter is advanced where you have to compound things, it might take a little longer. But again, if you have the metrics automated, it's running off hours, and users and managers alike can go into doors and see in the metrics module a breakdown for every single requirement spec. So this is very, very powerful. Of course, the things that cannot be represented with a filter, you could have custom code. So we do have certain things where we compare like the allocation parent requirement spec to the incoming traceability links. I mean, when you're looking at two different modules, that gets kind of complicated, so you need some custom code. So you could still do that, but the majority of the counts are automated using the filter-based approach from the attribute template, and that's a huge time saver. So basically, in summary, attribute template, using the concepts I've covered today, there's absolutely no reason as to why you cannot have an attribute template on every single program. And if there's a difference between attributes, you can use the same approach to account for those differences in the attribute template. And possibly there are other uses for the attribute template that I haven't thought of. But again, it should be a great, great starting point for helping you manage the complexity, especially when you start looking at supporting doors on larger programs. I think this applies to small programs or large programs, because again, especially because it drives metrics collection, I can't imagine as to why anybody wouldn't want to have this automation on their store program. So that is all I had, so I'll open this up to questions.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand using the raise hand button located in the GoToWebinar control panel. If at any time your question has already been answered, please lower your hand to remove yourself from the question queue. And please remember, if you prefer to ask a question via chat, you may also do so using the chat window located in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. In the meantime, it looks like a question has come in. Alex, can you provide some examples of the counts that you collect using this approach?
Sure. So as I mentioned, number of requirements, that's something we do right off the top of the head. I mean, you want to know how many requirements you have, and again, these are daily metrics, so you can keep track of this as the requirements are being developed. You can keep track of how many you have. Some other counts that are very useful are counts that have to do with requirement traceability. So for example, we keep track of how many parent level requirements have at least one incoming traceability link from a child, and an inverse where they do not have one. So for example, if I'm setting the system spec, I want to know how many requirements that I've allocated down to the subsystem don't have incoming traceability links. And we also do the inverse, where if you're sitting in a subsystem spec, we want to keep track of how many requirements have traceability to a parent requirement, basically a link going up, and how many don't. So it's really the childless parents and the requirements that don't trace up. That's the real important metric that you want to drive to zero. So as your requirements development effort is underway, you want to, again, the metrics directly indoors so the requirement authors can look at it, they can see where the problem areas are, and they can actually hone in on the problems using views that we provide, such that using the traceability views in the requirement modules, they could see exactly what the requirements are that don't have, let's say, any outgoing links up to parents. So we provide all that for our users.
Excellent, thank you. Our next question has come in. You mentioned the metric script. Is that something that we can get a copy of?
So I cannot hand out the metric script, but using the concepts that I covered in those slides, you really have kind of the guts of what you would need to put one together. I mean, I think the metric script, you could probably have that done in under a week. Again, highly recommend you test it out, have more than one person look at it. But again, if you use this approach, you write the metric script once, and then you don't have to touch it. And you can invent any counts as long as you can represent them through a Doors filter. And I think that's very powerful.
Great, thank you. Next question is, you were discussing earlier the copy attribute sample code, and can you share with us if the HTML files are included as menu items, and are they dynamic or static?
So the HTML menu items, I'm not sure I believe the answer is static, if I understand the question correctly. So basically the HTML menu items, you would export a view out of the attribute template into an HTML file, and then you would have to put the file into some location that the Doors client has access to it. In general, I recommend using a shared drive. And then as part of your menu item in the DXL code, you would have to point it to where that file is. So it would be static, and if you update the attribute template, for example, I would just do another export and just replace the HTML file. So that way your menu item can remain intact. You would just periodically update the shared drive location with the HTML file when the attribute template changes. That's similar to what we do.
Great, thank you. Our next question has come in. Can you discuss, can you associate the attribute template by competency, like hardware, software, or test?
So I recommend having one attribute template that contains everything. But through the use of attributes in the attribute template, you could surely distinguish if this applies to software or hardware or tests. So I encourage you to have the one attribute template, but then don't be shy to include other attributes that perhaps I didn't show here that would help specify in what modules this attribute is used in and what different disciplines it applies to.
Great, thank you. Our next question has come in. What is the integration point between the solution for metrics collection and Insight for reporting metrics? If you could talk to that, that'd be fantastic.
Well, I can surely talk to that, but probably not to the level of detail you'd like. So personally, I have not used Rational Insight. Because of the automation that we have right within Doors, we basically have it to a point where not only do we have the automated metrics collection going into a metrics module, but then we have automation that helps us extract that, basically a view out of the metrics module into an Excel spreadsheet. So it goes out like in a CSV format, which then could just be sucked into like some other tool. So again, I have not used Rational Insight, but we have a lot of automation with the DXL. This is a good example of that. That's working well for us. So for us, they just basically take the numbers and then they plug them into like a Excel macro that's already set up to showcase different charts.
Great, thank you. Our next question has come in, and it's, Alex, you use hundreds of scripts, and I have 4. These use different coding standards. Is there a need for a DXL central repository as it relates to coding standards, et cetera?
Well, if the question is relative to whether or not you need a DXL repository on your program, I think you definitely, I mean, it really depends if these are scripts that you run yourself or if these are scripts you want users to have access to. So for us, we have a lot of functionality we provide our users to make the tool basically help them do their job easier and faster. So anything that they'd be doing on a weekly, monthly, or even repetitive basis, we try and automate. And it's, if you, as the Doors team member, support automation for users, I would definitely recommend putting it out in a shared drive location such that you can configure their Doors clients once to point to this location and be done with it. And that way, if you need to update the automation that the users see, it's as simple as just updating the shared drive location for it. So I'm not sure if that was the intent of your question, but hopefully I answered it.
Yeah, thank you for that answer, and we can certainly address that further in our forum area in the Rational User community, which we'll talk to in a bit. In the meantime, our next question has come in, and they're wondering if you recommend running metrics on one project at a time, and if you could share your thoughts on generating management view showing metrics for all projects in Doors.
So right, so we actually run metrics on mobile. We have an automated task that kicks off metrics, the same script, and we run her across multiple projects. So again, kind of going back to the BAT file that I showed earlier, it's as simple as kind of just repeating a couple of those lines. So in the same BAT file, you could put in the name of a different project and another call to the Doors executable. And so you could have like 10 with these 2 lines repeated. So in your one scheduled task, they'll go off and run metrics across like 10 programs at once using the same script. So that's what we do, and I definitely encourage you to, again, it depends. I mean, obviously the program would have to be in the same Doors server. So we have instances where we have dedicated Doors servers and not dedicated Doors servers, but the point being is I would definitely run it on multiple programs. And again, I mean, Doors, as we know it, doesn't have a view where you could see things from multiple projects at once. I'm imagining Rational Insight has something like that. Again, not from my own experience. So we extract this data to Excel, and then we have other charts that are kept track of. Like something I did not cover as part of this presentation, but we also collect monthly metrics where we have counts for requirements volatility, like new, change, deleted, total, that type of thing, every fiscal month. So those get used in tracking books and that type of thing, and that would be on a per project basis.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, could you discuss the attribute template module, and is that something that you have to set up yourself, or does your reference earlier to the module being in a standard view provide it for you?
Sure. So the attribute template module is something that, again, if you don't work for Raytheon and you're a different company and you don't have such a concept such as attributes template, you would need to create the module at least once on your own. But again, it's literally you can create a brand new module, put in a couple of sections for standard attributes, standard views, and then start following the concepts that I just outlined, where you create, I mean, obviously you would need to know what the attributes are you want to keep track of. So hopefully, I highly recommend having a requirements development plan for each project where you outline basically what the requirement authors are on the hook for doing when they develop their requirements. And hopefully in there you have a table that says here are the attributes you're responsible for, and then your attribute template would be a one-to-one match. So you would have the same attributes that are called out in your requirements development documents. So you would create this once, and then every other program that wants to use the attribute template, I recommend just archiving the module and providing it as a starting point. That's what we do. We have an attribute template, basically template that we provide in the programs when they start up with doors. We configure it such that it makes sense for their program, meaning we would possibly remove some attributes, add some attributes. Again, if you can have the same attributes being used in all your programs, great. You could define the attribute template once and just reuse it by archiving and restoring it into different projects.
Great, thanks, Alex. Our next question has come in, and wondering, this presentation's been great, I'm wondering a bit about how the metrics collection process, does it not require extensive DXL experience?
No, it does not. As I've illustrated with this presentation, you really don't need to know much. You could take the code. I've included snapshots of. You would need some code that helps you loop through all your requirement specs. For those of you that attended Innovate 2012, I submitted the wrapper into the DXL script exchange. So that, in essence, would do the other piece for you that's not mentioned here, is how do you loop through all your requirement modules at once. But so it's really, you do not need extensive DXL experience to get this metrics script, because again, the real important pieces are included here, and the only other piece that's missing is really like opening the attribute template, opening the metrics module, and looping through your requirement specs. So in general, I think if you don't have much DXL experience, you might want to look into bringing somebody in that does have DXL experience, because you could, I mean, somebody that's an expert in writing DXL can real time from how long it takes your users to use doors, how long it takes you to extract data out of doors. So I'd encourage having somebody in your team that knows DXL, and again, maybe looking into bringing somebody else in who already has this experience.
That's excellent. Thank you, Alex. Our next question's come in. You've mentioned running metrics for a snapshot in time. Can you share your experience with running metrics and showing changes over time and how you store the historical data?
Sure. That's a good question. So, so again, we kind of have a set of tasks that we go through every fiscal month, and what those tasks include is actually, so again, so we have this daily metrics module, which is what I've talked to here, and we have the automated such that the metrics script runs off hours. So every day we have a snapshot as of yesterday. So on the first day of each fiscal month, we go in and we actually create we create a baseline in the metrics module, something along the lines of 2012 fiscal January. So I strike the baseline, which provides, so again, I do this on the first of each fiscal month. So like if I could go into the metrics module in one of my programs and see exactly what the counts were from like 2 years ago by loading like the 2010 December fiscal view or something along those lines. So in the daily metrics, I recommend grabbing a snapshot every fiscal month. On the monthly metrics, we run the monthly metrics every fiscal month, and the monthly metrics has capabilities in there that actually keeps track of like how many new requirements were added in the past month, how many changed, how many were deleted, that type of thing. So again, that wasn't covered here, but that's something very important. So both in our monthly metrics, we have the means to go back through the months and years, and likewise we do in the daily metrics by creating baselines. So I recommend doing that.
Thank you. Our next question has come in. I'm wondering if the collected metric data used with Excel to generate warm charts, or can this be generated indoors?
I'm not sure what worm charts are. So as far as I know, Doors is not a good tool for doing any sort of graphics or putting up charts. So I mean, based on what I know, I'd recommend using an outside tool. I mean, we have places where these numbers are sucked into like a completely different tool. But the point being is that it's very easy to generate a CSV file with numbers and rows. And then what you could do with that CSV file, I'm sure there's a lot of tools you could suck that into and do your displaying. So so personally, I mean, I've been writing DXL for 10 years, and I've been writing DXL for everything you can possibly imagine, whether it be user scripts, admin scripts, big focus on reuse. I mean, nowadays I have so many customizations that I don't even need to touch DXL on long periods of time from the point of view of actually updating anything, because everything was written with reuse in mind, such that I have these extended capabilities available to me. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend trying to draw a graph or charts using DXL.
Great, thanks, Alex. Looks like we have about time for one more question. A question just came in. Can you apply this to the project level as well as module level? For example, I'm wondering how many total requirements exist in a project, or how many total requirements exist in a module?
So that's a good question. So because this is based on the attribute template, and because this is based on filters, you physically can't apply a filter to a project. You have to apply a filter to a module. But if you use this approach, it's literally as simple as, again, either counting things in Excel. Once you dump the metrics view out, you could easily have a total which just summarizes how many requirements you have for that project in your Excel template. Or nothing says that you can't either have DXL post-processing that looks at the metrics module and actually counts this up for you. Maybe you could, so right off the top of my head, maybe you could put in a module level attribute into the metrics module, a DXL module level attribute that would kind of go through and count everything. So you'd have like one of these for, let's say, I've got a num required that's kept track of on a per module basis. But if you put in a some other attribute or the same attribute as a, yeah, I guess it would have to be a different attribute, as a module level attribute in the metrics module, you could have that, it could be a DXL attribute with code that says, okay, loop through all the objects in the metrics module and count up all the requirements and add them up and display them, something like that. So it could definitely be done.
Great, thanks, Alex. And I want to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending, and a special thank you to you, Alex, for your time today. And I want to let everyone know and invite everyone to please visit the Rational User Community to download the replay of the webcast as well as the presentation slides and gain access to other exclusive content. Just for members, if you're not a current member, please go to rationalug.org. It's free to join, and if you are a member, please log in. There is a forum, a community forum area where you can continue the discussion from today's webcast and find questions and answers posted from today's session. And I certainly want to share as well, Alex is the leader of the New England Rational User Group, and I encourage you to join if you're not a current member. Becoming a member of a group is a great way to meet fellow Rational users in your area. So once again, thank you for everyone's time today. The materials and links will be sent to you in a follow-up email. Have a great day, and you may now disconnect.